The author of focus in this author study is Charles Eastman. There are two predominant works being looked at within this study. The first one is Kill the Indian and Save the Man by Charles Eastman surveys his past by Jennifer Bess. The second work being analyzed is A Real Indian to Boy Scouts, Charles Eastman as a Resistance Writer by Penelope Merle Kelsey. First, we're going to break down Kill the Indian and Save the Man. Charles Eastman surveys his past. There are a few ideas that surround this text. The central idea of this paper is that Eastman is actively distancing and petrifying his past self, his younger self, the younger boy, Oyesa. There are a few other ideas that go along with this text. The narratives within the autobiographies written by Charles Eastman aren't simply just a narrative, but a timeline of adaptations endured by Eastman. The idea pushed by Elaine Eastman, Charles Eastman, and Pratt throughout these autobiographies is that Oyesa can exist in the modern world and are unable to adapt. Therefore, the past native must be petrified and killed. Charles and Elaine Eastman actively sacrifice Oyesa and distance themselves from him while also patronizing Oasis' little world throughout the text. To first understand Elaine Eastman and her influence on Charles Eastman, I want to define quickly what the Carlisle program is and who Richard Henry Pratt is. So Richard Henry Pratt uh, was the person over the entire Carlisle program, and he's known as like the father of Indian schooling in America and Indian acculturation. The program at Carlisle served mainly to completely break down the Indian from their past while annihilating their racial identity in order to compete in the race of life with other Americans. This assimilation was in fact genocidal in nature and eradicated many identities and traditions within native culture. One quote taken from the text and presented on these slides that sums up entirely what their goal is to make Indians capable and useful in general affairs of society. They advocate for the utility of the Indian, their usefulness in society. Elaine Eastman worked alongside Richard Pratt and oftentimes is seen supporting many of the ideas uh, pushed forth by Pratt during this time. There's some speculation about whether Charles Eastman was entirely behind his ideas that he wrote within the text. So there are some suggestions within this text that Elaine had a sort of influence on Eastman. Okay, so first let's see how um, Charles Eastman uh, removes himself from his younger version through language, particularly how it places emphasis on the individual. There's signs of acculturation of Eastman throughout the text. He seems to distance himself, especially through using the third person narrative. This is seen when he describes many of the events in his young life, such as the sacrificing of his dog in the ritual early on in his life to show that he had the qualities of a warrior. Also in the naming ceremony for the lacrosse, he distanced himself from Oyesa, and it almost seemed to an uneducated reader that he was talking about somebody that was not actually him. Essentially entraps Oyesa through language. He traps him, and that allows him to petrify and forget about Oyesa, to distance his new modern and assimilated self from Oyesa. There's a bit of ambiguity about Eastman towards assimilation near the end, where near the end of his autobiographies, where he's discussing whether he can whether he can be an Indian and an American at the same time. But it's clear throughout the text and his distancing from Oyesa, according to Bess, that he simply just is cutting all ties his with his past, and it pushed forth the agenda of both Elaine, Pratt, and eventually throughout the text we find Charles as well, that assimilation is the key for native survival. It is essential. And it is clear that Charles Eastman wants to petrify and distance himself from his past. He's divorcing his past. The second work, as part of this author study, is a real Indian to Boy Scouts, Charles Eastman as a resistance writer. Kelsey mainly focuses on in this text the fact that Eastman is a misunderstood writer and that he's a resistance writer and stands against many of the acts of assimilation to a degree. Again, there's much speculation within this writing of Elaine's influence in Eastman's writing, whether they were entirely his ideas. This was evident in the fact that he stopped writing when he separated from Elaine in 1921. Um, Eastman's father, Jacob Eastman, had been uh, in jail for part of his life, and his father experienced religious and cultural conversions while in prison, and decided that his son should learn a new way of life, learn new things. In Deep Woods, Eastman talks about his time working with the Boy Scouts as he saw how accepted the movement was and viewed it as an opportunity to gain further acceptance for the American Indian through discussing with impressionable young Euro-Americans. Kelsey uses Eastman's work alongside Boy Scout camps as a means of Eastman retaining his own native identity by seeking for a place in which American Indian cultural practices could still live on within a white society. There's a single argument that lies within all of these autobiographies, his seeking of trying to find a way for native culture to still exist, and it's that the Indian way is better. By engaging with young Euro-American children and teaching them about the Dakota ways of writing and camping, ultimately teaching them the ways that they survive in nature, a certain way tends to deculturate these young youth, and it indicates a cross-cultural sovereignty. And his work is helpful in gaining an American Indian quality in uh, the young boyhood writing autobiography by Charles Eastman. It, Eastman is seen misunderstanding the language of feathers, and his grandmother gets mad about this. His grandmother's rebuke over Odiesa's younger self about not knowing the language of feathers highlights the rigor of indigenous education and epistemology. His uncle's explanation after this incident with the language of feathers is extensive and thus implies a high level of sophistication and intelligence among the indigenous individuals. This is just one instance where it is seen that Eastman is not ostracizing and saying that native culture is less than. Also, in the religious practices, uh, with the sacrificial practice showing sacrificing his dog to show that he has the qualities of a warrior, and through the naming ceremony, his distance and use of third person narrative in that text is seen as a way to be respectful of these practices as they're often private and are very meaningful to the native society. Disagreements and common ground, the use of third person narrative. Uh, Best seems to think that it ostracizes and petrifies his younger self, whereas Kelsey seems to think that it's out of respect for the religious practice. And I tend to agree with this narrative. I think it's true. I believe Eastman uses the third person narrative to distance himself from that, not to distance himself from it, but to show respect for the practice. I believe that Eastman is pushing forth an assimilationist motive, but not to get rid of the Indian self, but to find a way in which we can recharacterize the Indian self for it to exist in society successfully.